Right now, on battlefields in Eastern Europe, cheap, remote-controlled machines packed with explosives are driving straight into tanks, trenches, and buildings, then detonating on command. It's one of the defining weapons of modern warfare, and it's not new. Germany built a version of this exact idea over 80 years ago. It was small, cheap, expendable, and remote-controlled from a safe distance. It was called the Goliath, and it might be the most overlooked weapon of the entire Second World War. Since tanks first appeared on the battlefield in World War I, infantry had struggled with the same basic problem. How do you destroy a heavily armored vehicle when you're just a person with a rifle? By World War II, the answer usually involved getting dangerously close, running up to a tank and physically attaching a magnetic mine or explosive charge, then hoping to get away before it detonated. It worked, but the survival rate for the soldier doing it was, to put it mildly, not great. Germany's engineers looked at this problem from a different angle. What if the thing running up to the tank wasn't a person at all? What if it was a machine, small, cheap, expendable, and controlled from a safe distance? That idea became the Leichter Ladungsträger Goliath, literally, light demolition carrier, though almost everyone just called it the Goliath. It's essentially a tiny, remote-controlled tank, roughly the size of a large suitcase, packed with explosives, designed to drive itself into a target and detonate. The Goliath was disarmingly simple in concept. It rolled on small tracks, similar to a miniature tank, and carried between 60 and 100 kilograms of explosives inside its hull, depending on the version. An operator, positioned safely in a trench or behind cover up to several hundred meters away, steered it using a control box connected by a thin cable that unspooled behind the vehicle as it moved. Once the Goliath reached its target, a tank, a bunker, a barricade, a cluster of enemy infantry, the operator triggered the explosive charge remotely, destroying the target and the vehicle itself in the same instant. It was, in the most literal sense, a one-way weapon. There was no retrieving it, no reusing it. Every single Goliath that reached its target was, by design, destroyed doing so. Two main versions were built. The earlier model used an electric motor, which was quiet but had limited range and speed due to battery constraints. The later, more common version switched to a small gasoline engine, which gave it more range and a slightly faster top speed, though fast is relative here, since the Goliath topped out at roughly 10 kilometers per hour, walking pace at best. Here's the part of the Goliath's design that's genuinely clever, and also genuinely its biggest flaw: that control cable. Unlike radio control, which could theoretically be jammed or intercepted, a physical wire connection was extremely reliable. There was no signal to disrupt, no interference from other electronics or terrain blocking a transmission. In an era before reliable, secure radio control existed for something this small and cheap, wired control was the practical solution. But a thin cable trailing behind a slow-moving vehicle in an open battlefield is also a very easy thing to simply shoot, or step on, or catch on debris. Allied and Soviet troops fairly quickly figured out that instead of trying to destroy the Goliath itself, the fastest way to neutralize it was to sever its control cable, leaving the vehicle harmlessly stranded, unable to receive commands, essentially neutered mid-mission. Some accounts describe soldiers specifically training to shoot for the cable rather than the vehicle, since a dead cable was just as good as a destroyed Goliath, and considerably easier to achieve than penetrating its armored hull. There's also the matter of speed. At walking pace, a Goliath crossing open ground gave defenders plenty of time to spot it, take aim, and either destroy it directly or cut its lifeline before it ever reached its target. Here's where the Goliath's story gets genuinely mixed. In the right circumstances, dense urban combat, narrow streets, situations where the vehicle's slow speed and short range weren't as much of a liability. It could be effective, particularly against fixed fortifications, barricades, and structures that couldn't shoot back or move out of the way. But against fast-moving, alert, well-trained troops in open terrain, its slow speed and vulnerable cable made it far less reliable than Germany had hoped.
Over 7,500 Goliaths were produced across the war, a genuinely large production run for such a specialized weapon. But by most historical accounts, it never became a decisive battlefield weapon on the scale Germany's engineers likely envisioned when the project began. Some of its most notable combat use came during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, where German forces used Goliaths against Polish resistance fighters entrenched in city buildings, a use case that actually played to the weapon's strengths, since urban combat meant shorter distances, more cover for the cable, and stationary targets that couldn't easily maneuver away. So the honest verdict is, not a war-winning weapon, but also not a total failure. More of a specialized tool that worked well in narrow circumstances and struggled everywhere else. Which, in a strange way, makes it a fairly accurate preview of exactly how modern drone warfare has actually played out. This is the part of the story that makes the Goliath worth revisiting today, instead of just filing it away as a historical curiosity. The core concept, a cheap, expendable, remotely operated machine that drives or flies itself into a target and detonates, keeping a human operator safely out of harm's way, is exactly the operating principle behind the loitering munitions and kamikaze drones currently being used on a massive scale in the war in Ukraine. Modern one-way attack drones follow almost the identical logic the Goliath was built around 8 decades earlier. It's cheaper and more acceptable to lose a machine than a soldier, and a remote operator can strike a target without ever being in its immediate blast radius. Even some of the Goliath's specific vulnerabilities have modern parallels. Just as troops in the 1940s learned to sever the control cable rather than destroy the vehicle itself, modern electronic warfare units specifically target the radio and GPS links that modern drones depend on. Different technology, same underlying principle. Disable the connection between operator and machine, and the weapon becomes harmless, regardless of how much explosive it's carrying. The U.S. military has, in fact, recently begun training with and adopting battle-tested kamikaze drone systems developed in Ukraine, and the U.S. Navy has tested similar one-way attack drone boats in Pacific exercises. Official recognition that this category of cheap, expendable, remotely operated weapon has become a serious and permanent part of modern military doctrine, not just an improvised wartime workaround. In other words, Germany wasn't wrong about the concept back in the 1940s. They were just about 80 years too early, working with cable and suitcase technology instead of encrypted radio links and AI-assisted targeting. A few facts worth knowing. Its name was almost sarcastic. Naming a machine roughly the size of a suitcase Goliath, after the biblical giant famously defeated by a much smaller opponent, is a strange choice, though it's unclear whether German engineers intended the irony or simply liked the sound of a name implying overwhelming power. It briefly inspired a nickname among the troops facing it. Allied soldiers reportedly referred to it, somewhat dismissively, as the Beetle tank, partly because of its low, compact profile, and partly because stepping on the cable, the simplest way to neutralize it, felt a lot like squashing an actual beetle. It was surprisingly expensive for what it did. Despite being a single-use, disposable weapon, each Goliath cost roughly as much as several standard infantry rifles to produce, a significant investment for a machine that self-destructed on its very first and only use, assuming it reached its target at all. A handful still exist in museums today, Surviving examples can be found in several military museums across Europe, giving visitors a chance to see in person just how small and almost toy-like this weapon actually looked up close. A strange contrast to the amount of destruction it was built to deliver. The Goliath never became one of the war's headline weapons. It doesn't have the scale of the Mouse or the fame of the Tiger tank or the tactical revolution of the STG-44. But it might be one of the most quietly important weapons on this channel so far, because it wasn't really a product of its own time. It was a rough draft of an idea that wouldn't fully mature for another 80 years. Expendable machines doing the dying, so people didn't have to. Germany built a suitcase-sized robot that could be neutralized by shooting a wire. Today, that same basic idea, refined with GPS, encrypted radio, and artificial intelligence, is reshaping how wars are fought on an entirely different scale. Sometimes the most interesting weapons in history aren't the biggest or the deadliest. They're the ones that were simply ahead of their time. If you want to see the flip side of this story, the desperate, scraped-together weapons Germany built when it had almost nothing left to fight with, let me know in the comments.